4, even though it's our 3rd live week of Great Decisions at Manitowoc Public Library. Before I bring up the person who will be introducing our speaker this evening, I wanted to go through my usual pre-game routine. So just to thank everyone who makes the Great Decisions lecture series at Manitowoc Public Library possible: the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Friends of Manitowoc Public Library, the University of Wisconsin-Manitowoc, and the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. So big round of applause for all our sponsors. Also, just to call a couple quick things as always to your attention, there are these pamphlets over by the now depleted snack area. You guys do a great job with the snacks, that is definitely for sure. But there's a pamphlet for donating, bequeathing, setting up a foundation to go to the foundation, because the truth of the matter is, we love presenting the widest variety of programs, such as Great Decisions, as well as a multitude of other things to the library. But the truth is, we constantly need help, because it's something that's not budgeted. So your generosity helps to keep programs like this afloat. So there is a pamphlet over there for that type of donation. The other that I wanted to bring up is a fundraiser that is happening a week from this coming Saturday on March 10th. It is the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation's 2018 fundraising gala, Create Tomorrow. It is taking place on the evening of Saturday, March 10th, between 6 and 10 p.m. It's an incredible evening. If you'd like to learn more about it, I'm not going to go over it because a lot of you have heard me going over it the past couple weeks, but there are invitations over by the now depleted snack area and the table as you come into the room. A lot of tremendous things, including an aerial dance troupe that is performing in the library, which is something you don't hear about every day. So that's enough of me going on about things that you may or may not want to hear about, but I would like at this point to bring up Darlene Wellner, who will be introducing our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. It is just so nice to look out at this audience. You are just wonderful folks. I am delighted to introduce Marty Farrell from Fond du Lac County and from former professor at Ripon University. Many of you have heard him before, and he, I think, is our most favorite, not necessarily speaker, but I think he probably is, because we keep inviting him back. And I think you've been here almost every year since we started back 11 years ago. And just to say, our program here with Great Decisions was modeled after the Fond du Lac experience, and we probably wouldn't be in business here if it hadn't been for my friend Meg McLean and the Fond du Lac League of Women Voters, that she talked to me about it as we were going to a meeting in Madison for League, and about how successful Great Decisions was there, and how, people just kept coming, and they'd had it for years, and Marty was mentioned, and the library, which was also a co-sponsor, as well as other organizations, and I just thought, we could do that here. And we have, and it's a nice collaborative effort that we have here, and it's just a pleasure to be part of this. So, Martin Farrell's expertise spans many regions of the world, including Europe, Asia, South and Central America. Along with Professor Dean Katahira, he has developed an international film course that has shown more than 700 films over the last 20 years. Farrell also is a founding member of the Wisconsin Institute, representing Ripon College on its board. He was an active member in the WIPCS's Speakers Program and served as executive director of the Institute's executive board for 4 years. He has a great expertise as far as county government, served on the county board, and has been president for a number of years. I think they're really lucky to have you, Marty. He is a frequent speaker all over the state. He's going to Franklin, where Rachel Motion Young originally was part of this program, is the director of the library, and he's got 2 speaking engagements there. So, and he's going to Washington, D.C. He's really an in-demand guy. In 2014-15, he received the Dick Ringler Distinguished Peace Educator Award for the state of Wisconsin. So please welcome Marty Farrell. I just got one slight announcement. I just have one slight announcement here. Slight, no, it's a big one. The League of Women Voters has a forum on the county executive, which is Thursday. Is it Thursday? March 15th at City Hall at 7 p.m. So hope you all come. That's a big one. So, okay.
Thank you very much, Darlene. Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back in Manitowoc this evening. I have been here most years in the last decade or so, and I thank you for inviting me, and I've always enjoyed the great turnout, but also the great participation and questions. So I try to make sure we have plenty of time for those tonight. As I was mentioning, I want to thank all the sponsors of the series also. I was mentioning to some of the League of Women Voters folks at dinner tonight, I may not be hitting on all however many cylinders I'm supposed to have. 8, 6, 4, I don't know. I spent last night in a sleep laboratory down in Oshkosh. And the timing, I guess, could have been better, but I've been having a little trouble. You know, don't get up a little bit up in age. You don't sleep quite as well as maybe you once did. I don't know, should we have a show of hands on that? Or I don't think we have to. So anyway, they fixed me all up with about 20 different types of devices all over my body, a couple straps here and there, and then shoved me into bed at 8:45 and said, "Go to sleep, damn it." Well, it was a little bit hard. It's a little bit early for me, for one thing. It wasn't totally comfortable, but yeah, I managed to finally fall asleep, and I was having a pretty good, I was sleeping pretty well, pretty deep sleep. And of course, right in the middle of that, the same person, not sure if it was Nurse Ratchet or exactly what her name was, but time to get up. 5:15 a.m. So, if I'm not 100%, that'll be my excuse. And normally I just drive over here from Ripon and I have the presentation and discussion with you folks and I drive back. Tonight I didn't think that'd be a smart idea. So I'll be staying over under one of your bridges over here. You have a lot of nice bridges, and well, I haven't gotten a check yet from the series, so. Okay. So, China, America, the new geopolitical equation. So we have the little cartoon here with the Chinese dragon and Uncle, the American eagle, asking, "Have you put on a little weight lately?" He's smashed all the way through the chair. That's one thing I can tell you for sure. The equation has changed. If no other reason, and quite honestly, I'm not going to argue that it's because of American decline. I don't think that's true. It's just that China has experienced the most extraordinary economic, industrial, and technological growth that quite possibly the world has ever seen. And I have some quotations in here from, for instance, Henry Kissinger, who went to China in 1971 as part of the improvement of relations that he and President Nixon brought about with China at that time. But having seen China in 1971, he said, if you'd showed me a picture of what Beijing looks like today and tell me that's what it was going to be 40 years later, I'd have said that's absolutely impossible. I first went to China in 1981, and I can tell you they hadn't changed much since 1971 either at that time. Tallest building in Shanghai was 22 stories. Western building, what they call the Bund, that was the tallest building in the whole city of Shanghai. Today, Shanghai has more skyscrapers than New York City. Again, in one generation. So this is the nature of the challenge that we're facing. So let's take a look. We're going to have some geography tonight because geopolitics is part of it. There'll definitely be economics. There'll be some history. So it's a multidisciplinary approach that we need to take to this. But starting with geography, and I think Robert Kaplan is an excellent writer on geopolitics and geography because he combines knowledge of geography with a knowledge of the culture and the history of the areas, plus he actually goes there. He actually visits these places, he puts his feet on the ground, he meets the people, he talks to them. His book, The Revenge of Geography, I know your library has it here, I highly recommend it. Also he has one just on the US, Earning the Rockies, I believe it's called. It's another one just about American geography and history. But as he points out, China, with its huge size, continental size, and it's about exactly the same size as the United States in area, including Alaska, but all in one contiguous piece here. But also it has 9,000 miles of coastline with lots of excellent harbor possibilities here. The latitude is an excellent range. From Harbin is about the same as Maine in the United States, up here in Manchuria, whereas Hainan Island, this would be around Cuba in terms of latitude. So you have everything, a lot of temperate and a lot of change in latitudes, which allows for a variety of crops to be growing. Also, it's right next to the primary shipping channels of the entire world. 2/3 of the world's shipping traffic, whether it be oil, manufactured goods, raw materials, goes right through this particular area. It also is connected to Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and Northeast Asia. Northeast Asia, there's some obvious problems there. But again, sometimes having these neighbors, all these neighbors can be problematic because relations, if you have a lot of neighbors, chances are relations with some of them aren't going to be too good. U.S. is better situated that way with just two neighbors. One pretty sparsely populated and usually friendly. In Mexico, not a threat, I don't think. So militarily, certainly. And so we are more fortunate in that particular regard. Now, we also have two oceans, both Atlantic and Pacific, but there are some problems there too. So, for example, I'm not sure if you still make boats here in Manitowoc. Yeah? Good. So if you make a boat, a big boat, here in Manitowoc, and you want to get it to the ocean, you only have one way to go, right? Great Lakes, Great Lawrence Seaway, Atlantic Ocean. What if you want in the Pacific Ocean? You got to go all the way around South America, at least you did originally. Except then what? Theodore Roosevelt became our president, said, I don't like that. We need to link up our oceans a little bit better. How about a canal? Well, the French had tried to build a canal through the isthmus of Central America, but failed. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to build that canal, so he went to the government of Colombia, which controlled the isthmus at that time, and asked them to participate in that exercise. They said, no, we're not interested. Well, what happened then? Turned out there was a little rebellion on the isthmus, aided by U.S. warships, that established a brand new country called Panama. And the new Panamanian government agreed to build the canal. And actually at Ripon College we had quite a number of Panamanian students when I was there. And I was fortunate enough to teach one named Jose Alemán, who later went on to be foreign minister of Panama, and was foreign minister when sovereignty of the canal and the canal zone was returned to Panama in the year 2000. But when we originally built the canal and established a country that was going to permit that, Teddy Roosevelt invoked, of course, the Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, but he said, this is not law, this is our policy. Don't waste your breath on law. This is what we're going to do. Okay, now I bring that up for two reasons tonight. One is I thought it was an interesting comparison because it sure did make our transportation between our two oceans a lot easier. But also it was kind of a might makes right situation. And we better be careful or we might be facing the same thing in the South China Sea today. Because it could well be that China, with its tremendous economic growth and gradually increasing military power, may come to view the South China Sea and the East China Sea as the equivalent to what we saw the Caribbean and the Americas as our sphere of influence. And that's a challenge. I don't have an answer to that. But I'm just saying, we were the rising power at that time. We had not been the world dominant power, that had been the United Kingdom. But our power was growing after the Civil War, and this was part of it. And Theodore Roosevelt felt we had to assert ourselves. This was our destiny. And that was part of what he did. But other nations can rise as well and may make similar assertions. And we have to be ready for it and figure out how we're going to handle it. Okay, just briefly on the little bit more on the geography here. Let me get my obstacle course out of the way. So here we see the various different climatic zones of China. So this allows for quite a variety of crops to be grown, from winter wheat and corn in the north, rice, of course, in the center and the south, also in the southwest. Here's a picture of centuries-old terracing. This is how the Chinese grew rice, even on mountainsides, by building these elaborate terraces. And you can see them flooded here, very picturesque, but also necessary, because although they have a lot of good climate variation, a lot of the land isn't that good. So it's a mountainous country out west, a lot of desert, Gobi Desert, steppes where you can't really grow crops. You can graze, herd animals, horses, cattle, things of that nature, but you can't really grow crops. So in fact, they've had to feed what is today 20% of the world's population on just 7% of the world's arable land. And you can do that through very intensive cultivation, but they're actually an importer of food today. But things were much worse. And this is part of their success story. It actually begins with agriculture. Because again, when I first went to China in 1981, we in our group towered over the people. I mean, even me. And again, I have shrunk a couple inches, which I'm not real happy about either. They never told me about that one back in junior high health class. I couldn't have done much about it anyway. But no, seriously, just normal height, we towered over the people. Go to China today. How many of you have been to China? I would be surprised there aren't quite. Well, good, wonderful. We don't tower over them. And by the way, anything I say, if you have evidence to contradict it or add to it in any way, feel free to do so. Because in a huge country like this, you can see an example of almost everything. But today, we don't tower over them. And I took another student group there in 2012. Actually, I took a total of 5 groups over the years, but most recently in 2012. Look, the fact is they were malnourished when we were there. Their life expectancy was probably 40 to 50 years at best. Now it's over 70. Why were they malnourished? Because of Mao Zedong's horrible, extreme communist economic policies. So he briefly, in the countryside, after confiscating all the land from the private owners, which is something that, you know, communists feel they have the right to do since they're against private property, but it also gives you a tremendous ace in the hole, power-wise, when you control all the land in the country, which they do to this day, but they are utilizing it much better now. But under Mao, first collective farms were formed, then cooperatives were formed, and finally communes. So there might be a whole county in one commune, might be 15,000 peasants going out to work the fields and the rice paddies all together. Might be 15 or even 20,000 all working together. And at the end of the year, whatever meager produce was left over after they delivered to the state, to the government, what the government needed in order to feed the people living in the cities, at the price the government told them they would pay, not a market price, what meager proceedings were left over would be divided among all the members of the commune equally. So if you were a go-getter and worked twice as hard as I did, and twice as efficiently and twice as effectively, and I just took it easy and, you know, kind of went through the motions, we both got the same at the end of the day. And of course, in the Great Leap Forward is even worse. I won't go into detail on that, but that was an attempt to also make steel out in the countryside. So all the pots and pans, anything with iron in it was collected. They tried to make backyard blast furnaces. There's a great movie out there, plus there are documentaries, but a feature film called To Live, which shows you how this went down and what the horrible results were. Up to 30 million people starved to death as a direct result of this. And the effects of this were still there as late as 1981. However, this is where the change started to happen. And let's move on to the next. Here's just something I need to mention here that we need to keep in mind for later. This is about the ethnic diversity in China. So it actually is more ethnically diversified. Yes, about 90% of the people are considered Han Chinese. This would be the majority Chinese population. So they are, you know, centered in this core area. The way, the triangles, those are Chinese Muslims. And there are millions of Muslims in China, and they're in every county of China. There are more of them in the west and in the southwest, but they actually are found in every county of China. Then we have various minority groups, such as Tibetans, Thai, and so forth. So just keep that in mind. And it's in these far-flung areas that the minorities tend to be concentrated.
Marty?
Yes.
Aren't there a minority called Uyghurs too?
Yes. So that would be the dominant group in Xinjiang province up here. Now this is by linguistic group, so that's called Turkic. They speak a Turkic language. They are related to Turks. The name that the dissident Uyghurs would like to give this territory is East Turkestan. They are descended of Turkic people, and they are Muslim, as are Turks. But this is by language. Whoops, sorry. This is by language, so that's why they don't call them Uyghurs. They call them by their language group.
Are they the biggest minority?
No. I think the Wei are the biggest minority. This is very sparsely populated. There just aren't that many people, period. As you can see, major uninhabited areas. Miao, I think, are a large group. That is what we call Hmong. They would be down here in these areas. I believe the Wei are the largest ethnic minority. Okay. Okay, now this we're going to come back to later, but this again is based on their geography. This is probably, I have some things here that I'm presenting tonight that I think are kind of mind-boggling, because again, the scope of things is so extreme. But this may be the most mind-boggling slide of all, and we will come back to it a little bit later. But this is the new plan China's government unveiled in 2014, sometimes called the New Silk Road, or One Belt or One Road. But this is China's new economic outreach initiative. So they have already pledged a solid $1.4 trillion in cooperation with all these other countries. There's 6 proposed economic corridors. These are the darker colored ones. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So extending into Southeast Asia, South Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Central Asian republics, and Iran into Turkey. These are new economic corridors. It will consist of a lot of physical infrastructure, but also communications equipment, fiber optic cable, new railroads. They already are sending railroad trains, whole trains, from eastern China all the way actually to London, through the Channel and into London. Now, the same train can't go all that way because the track gauges aren't the same. But what they're developing, these are all containerized railroad cars, and they have established and are establishing these modern crane systems to transfer the containers from one train to the next where it matches the new rail bed. Eventually they might exchange the rail bed, but it's probably not necessary. Using these cranes to transfer the containers is so efficient that it's probably cheaper to just do that than build all new tracks through some of these countries, because this is some pretty rugged terrain in a lot of these countries. It's much faster than going by boat, but much cheaper than going by air. And so the railroads are going to be a vital link there. They're building railroads in Africa. That's what these lines, some exist, some are going to be built. Gas pipelines. Gas pipelines, these are ways of getting gas into China or exporting gas if they have extra. But they're a huge user of energy materials, as you know. Oil pipelines, similarly, and ports. Port facilities engaged with Chinese maritime trade. Look here, even on the west coast of Africa, even several ports being built, existing ports, also on the eastern coast of Africa. So this is just a tremendously ambitious project that is going to project Chinese economic power, but also economic engagement. They are selling this to these countries as mutually beneficial. We're going to help you build these cranes to change railroad cars. And when you do that, you are creating jobs, and you will see economic development. And it'll make it easier to get goods to your country and to get goods out of your country so that you can export things. This will benefit all of us. It will tie us together. So this is a win-win proposition that they are putting to all these countries. And they have the money to do it with a $4 trillion sovereign wealth fund, which they have accumulated. And to think that this tremendously progressive, ambitious project is going on at a time when we here in the United States, and this is a challenge to you, we are talking about walling ourselves in and cutting ourselves off. I think it ought to give you something to think about. Who is going to be dominant in the world 30, 40, 50 years from now? A country that is projecting outward, forging new ties that they at least say are going to be mutually beneficial, or a country that's cutting itself off because everybody else is always picking on us and taking advantage of us, and so we'll take our ball and go home. Just something to think about. Okay, little of the history now. Because of a lot of those favorable characteristics and also the very early centralization of China, China was unified under its first dynasty, the actual historical dynasty, in 221 BC. This was the Qin dynasty that China gets its name from. And our dinnerware, in turn, gets its name from the porcelain that they made. Before that, in the time of Confucius, China was very ununified. It's called the Warring States period. But China, in a period of a couple hundred years, went from 170 different jurisdictions down to 5, down to 1. And that was the Qin Shi Huangdi, who defeated the 4 other kingdoms and established the first Chinese empire. Now that only lasted 14 years, but it was succeeded quite rapidly without things going completely to pot by the Han dynasty, which then in 2 different versions ruled for over 400 years. And that got them off to an excellent start, I can tell you. But for most of its history, because of that early unification, leader in population, wealth, military power, governance, and a lot of technological innovation. Just some of the, things there: silk, porcelain, paper, printing, compass, crossbow, gunpowder, exploding cannonball, landmine, rudder, horse collar, blast furnace, cast iron, kites, noodles, lottery, and, thank God, toilet paper. Although when I went there in 1981, you would not have known that they invented toilet paper. You're on your own on that one. China had potential for world domination. If we look to the Ming Dynasty, between 1405 and 1433, their Hui Muslim admiral Zheng He led 7 voyages totaling over 50,000 kilometers. On the very first voyage, they had 317 ships, led by 6 9-masted treasure ships, dozens of horse ships. They had cannons, 28,000 armed troops. That was in 1405. When Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire 130 years later. He did so with 168 troops and a couple dozen horses and a couple dozen guns. What could China have done with 28,000 armed soldiers in a flotilla? They could have done a lot. This is where he went as far as the eastern coast of Africa. He was a Muslim. He did go to Mecca. In fact, I believe he died in the Arabian Peninsula. So this was some serious traveling. This was one of those 9-masted treasure ships, over 400 feet long. The drawing compares it with the Santa Maria of Christopher Columbus, about 75 years later. But at that point, China turned its back on conquest. Partly it was due to internal infighting between palace eunuchs and Confucian scholars after the death of the young Lei emperor. But there were other factors. It was very expensive to send out these expeditions, and they weren't really getting much benefit directly. Yeah, they brought back giraffes and zebras and exotic animals, but other than that, frankly, China didn't think it had that much to gain from these other countries. But later, they did set up this tributary system where, again, China did not try to take them over, did not conquer them, just said, we want you to show us respect, which meant kowtowing, kneel down 3 times. In return, we'll trade with you, and we won't invade you. And so some believe this tributary tradition will be more China's approach in the 21st century rather than conquest, since they don't really have a history of conquest. But they do have a history of wanting to trade to get what benefits they can from the interactions. But again, they stress, again, this is to be a win-win situation for both sides. Not, some people think that China's growth has come at our expense. But frankly, most of it is not come at our expense. They've created new wealth. And I'm going to get to how they did that in just a moment. But then around 1800, China went into decline. Why? Again, a lot of ink spilled over this. But fundamentally, although they were advanced in a lot of technological areas, it was all based still on trial and error for the most part. They didn't have basic principles like Newtonian principles or advanced mathematics like calculus. We had a scientific revolution of that kind, and then what followed from that was an industrial revolution. So I have a quote here from historian Joel Moker. Western civilization came to rule the world as a result of one thing: our ability to understand the forces of nature and to harness them for our economic needs. In Europe, people started being skeptical. People like Descartes. Remember Descartes, the French philosopher? He doubted everything. He said, I'm going to doubt everything. I'm going to doubt everything I see, everything I hear, everything I smell. I'm doubting everything. What can I be sure of? How can I be sure of anything? He finally came up with cogito ergo sum. The one thing, if I'm doubting, at least there's a doubting going on. There's a thinking. There's a mind. And because there's a thinking, now I know I exist. Cogito ergo sum. From that, he built up geometry, other sciences, and mathematics. It began with this radical skepticism. This skepticism leads to contestability. Arguments are decided not on authority, but on evidence, logic, and mathematical proof. To Mokir, that is the basis of our Western progress. Arguments not decided on authority, but on evidence. Again, I'm afraid some people in our Western cultures today are forgetting that. But they also definitely weren't interested in China. Because China, the authority of the ancient thinkers like Confucius and Mencius, Lao Tzu, and the Buddha, these were not to be doubted. They did not have a scientific revolution. They did not have a revolution of skepticism. They did not have an industrial revolution. So in 1764, Hargrave in England came up with his spinning jenny. China was making textiles at the same time, but in a very short period of time, one worker in England could produce the yarn using the spinning jenny of 66 Chinese workers. And then it just multiplied from there. So now the economic might and the tremendous wealth being created by these new industries allowed Britain and other European powers to build up big armies and navies. I didn't bring the exact quote, but it was just around the year 1800 when King George of Britain, the same King George we rebelled against, sent a representative to the Qing dynasty court at that time and asked to establish diplomatic and trade relations. And the response basically was, well, that's very quaint of you to ask, but you know, if we really wanted anything you had or thought that you had anything worthwhile to say, we might be willing to consider it. But since you don't and we don't, we'll see you later. Same thing happened. The United States actually sent a representative to the same Qing court and was turned away, as we'll see. So they're very condescending. They had nothing to learn from the West. Well, pretty soon they were crushed. So Opium Wars, not going in the whole history, but it showed that China now is a weakling after all these years of domination. Then the French proved it by taking away the southern parts of China and Indochina, what we know as Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. And then Japan even, which had been no more industrialized than China, but carried out something called the Meiji Restoration and decided they would copy the West very fast in order to catch up. By the late 19th century, they were able to beat up on China quite easily. And then, of course, in 1911, the imperial system is finally overthrown by Sun Yat-sen. Country of China falls into a lot of disorder for a while. The Kuomintang Chinese Nationalist Party finally comes out on top under Chiang Kai-shek, but they are having to fight communists almost immediately. And then Japan starts encroaching again in 1931. This goes on till the end of the war, World War II. And then we have the Chinese Civil War, communists ultimately winning that. Kuomintang leadership retreats to the island of Taiwan. Now, if we go just to the communist era in China, initially they were allied with the Soviet Union. But then by 1956, when Khrushchev gives his secret speech denouncing Stalin, Mao is not pleased with this, begins to see the Soviet Union as revisionist. 1958, they kick out all the Soviet advisors. By 1960, an open split. And by 1969, we now know they almost came to war on the northern border of China. We didn't really know that at the time, how close they really were. At least I didn't. Maybe our CIA did. Maybe that's why Nixon and Kissinger went to China when they did, shortly after that. But between 1960 and 72, we have a so-called revolutionary foreign policy. Again, this is trying to stir up revolution all around the world. Be like us, overthrow the bourgeoisie, overthrow the Soviet revisionists, have worldwide revolution. That didn't really come to much of anything. So in 1972, they calmed down, said we'll reconcile with the United States, and we won't say we want to overthrow them anymore, and we'll get on better terms with them, and they'll help us counterbalance the Soviet Union that we still don't like. 1976, Mao dies. For 2 years, there's kind of a power struggle in the Communist Party, but eventually Deng Xiaoping wins out, and he initiates the reform era. And that's what is actually, I'll say a little bit more about that, but that's what's culminated in this tremendous economic growth that is impressive on the one hand, but also can be scary on the other hand when you look at the implications. Okay, now, highlights of U.S.-China relations. Oh boy. When do we have to get out of here? There will be a quiz on this. Every wrong answer, I get another cookie. No, seriously, just very briefly, if you don't, by the way, anybody wants this, just send me an email, I'll send you the whole thing. But again, as early as 1784, we did try to establish relations. We were turned away. 1844, we finally did. This is after China was defeated and then realized it was going to have to play ball with the other countries. This was interesting. In 1868, after the Civil War, the Burlingame Treaty opened the U.S. to immigration from China, mainly for employment in railroad construction and mining. And so tens or even hundreds of thousands of Chinese when the Chinatowns were established. But then we slammed the door shut with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and it stayed shut to Chinese immigrants for the next 60 years. In the 1890s, we had missionary activities. Some of you have read Pearl Buck, her great work. She grew up as one of many who grew up as a missionary there. We had the open door policy. We did send in some of our troops that were in the Philippines after we took that away from Spain to put down the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. Qing Dynasty overthrown in 1911. We recognized the Republic of China under the KMT, tried to aid them against both Japan and the Communist Party, but the Communists won anyway. Then we had the Korean War, where we ended up fighting Chinese, not initially, but after we had pushed the North Korean Communist Army north of the 38th parallel, we kept going and up to what the Chinese thought was too close to their border, and they sent in a couple of million of so-called volunteers, human wave assaults, which pushed us back down to the other end of the peninsula. So we actually actively fought the Chinese in the last 2.5 or so years of the Korean War. So relations are pretty bad then for the next almost 2 decades. But Kissinger and Nixon then do visit. In 1979, we restore full diplomatic relations. We approve the People's Republic of China as the representative of China in the UN Security Council. We affirm a one China policy that Taiwan ultimately one day should be part of China. 1989, Tiananmen Square. You remember that, probably many of you. That led to cooling of relations. 99 was another incident which we were trying to keep Slobodan Milosevic out of Kosovo, if you remember that. And we did drop some bombs right in Belgrade, Serbia. Blew out some bridges. One bomb hit the Chinese embassy, killed 3 people. They weren't convinced it was an accident. Well, I think it was an accident, but they thought we were too good to make accidents like that. 2001, this is when a People's Liberation Army jet collided with a U.S. spy plane. The Chinese pilot was killed. Our people weren't killed, but they were captured for a few weeks. This is a time, I think, when the George W. Bush administration was probably ready to confront China and say, okay, this is going to be our number one priority. The Soviet Union, was not in any kind of, Russia was in bad shape. They were not any kind of threat at all. I think the Bush administration would have made China the number one focus of our foreign and defense policy at that time. But then just a few months later, 9/11 happened. The planes hit the Twin Towers. And quite honestly, ever since then, our main attention has been back in the Middle East, whether we think it should be or should have been or not. Yes, in 2011, President Obama, Secretary Clinton announced a new pivot to Asia, but things were going so badly in Iraq and Afghanistan, they actually had to put more troops back in there. In 2016, I think this was an important initiative, U.S. joining 11 other nations in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. See, that would have been the equivalent to the new Silk Road initiative that China is undertaking, but with the U.S. in the lead. And China was not a part of that. And it would have allowed us to have stronger ties and mutually beneficial trade. They're not stealing from us, we're not stealing from them. We're making a free exchange of goods and services. They do what they're good at, we do what we're good at. And we're both better off. But that, of course, has been at least temporarily scuttled because President Trump has withdrawn. Okay, all kinds of things to talk about. But now let's look at the tremendous economic growth. So I realize this only goes through 2004, but I like it because it shows you the different, and again, I have to be brief because we still have a lot to cover, but you can see this is their GDP back in the Mao years. It's barely going up even though their population is growing. Their actual total factor productivity during this period of the 50s and 60s and early 70s, their productivity was actually going down by over 1% a year. In other words, they were getting less output out of every unit of input, less output every single year. Because they had these, frankly, cockamamie communes out in the countryside. They're trying to make steel in the backyard. And they have Soviet-built factories to top it off. Going nowhere. Deng Xiaoping comes into office. Deng Xiaoping had gone to France when he was in his 20s. And that's in the 1920s. He saw that workers in France, some of them were in communist unions, some of them were in socialist unions. They were advancing their cause. They were getting a better way of life. He saw under his own communist leadership it wasn't getting better. And he knew Japan was making tremendous strides. He knew South Korea, which had been totally destroyed in the Korean War. You had these armies marching up and down the peninsula, blowing up everything in sight for over 3 years. It was a complete mess. South Korea, in just a few decades, emerged one of the leading industrial powers of Asia. Singapore, much smaller, but tremendously dynamic. And even Taiwan was doing much better. Deng Xiaoping saw this. Deng Xiaoping was then purged by Mao and sent to work in a tractor factory when the Cultural Revolution was started. Because already Deng Xiaoping had been, too pragmatic. He had the idea, who cares about the color of a cat as long as it catches a mouse? That was one of his slogans. Mao cared only about the color of the cat. It had to be a red cat, damn it. And the redder, the better. And whether it caught a mouse or not, he didn't care. All politics to him. He's at the tractor factory. His daughter's coming for a visit. He asks the fellow workers, hey, do you guys have some transistor radios you'd like to have repaired? My daughter knows how to repair them. Why don't you just bring them in and I'll have her fix them for you? They looked at him incredulously. Transistor radio? What's that? We can't even afford a bicycle. We can't afford a wristwatch. We have nothing. He was ashamed. Because this is 1968. This is 20 years after the successful revolution in the workers' paradise, and they're malnourished, they're uneducated, and they can't even afford a transistor radio. So that's when the communes were broken up, and it went to the household responsibility system. So now every household in the area gets its own plot of land. You work it, you grow what you want. Yeah, we still need a certain amount of grain at a certain price, but other than that, you grow what you want, and you sell the rest on a free market in the village. So they started all of a sudden churning out surpluses. Now somebody else gets a job. Hey, maybe I don't want to work in the rice paddy. I have a bicycle. I'll put a cart on it. I'll help get your goods to market. And I'll take part of your profit by helping you get it to the market. And then I'll be able to buy a motorized scooter. And then I'll be able to buy a truck. And multiply this over 35 years, and you have billionaire trucking executives in China. A lot of them. Because they also have highways now. So that helps too. This household responsibility system was the first step in getting China's economic growth going. They increased their productivity by almost 50% in just the first 5 years. That's very hard to do. And it's continued to improve. Just a couple other things on that. Yeah, between, it keeps continuing to improve. They keep consolidating. So it used to be each household had just one, very small plot. It would only be an acre or two, let's say. But you can actually grow a lot of stuff on an acre if you really do it, carefully. But now they need to combine them, obviously. Since 2008, it's possible for a farmer to rent or lease land from other farmers, who in turn are leasing it from the village council, which still owns the land. But you can get a 15-year lease or with a 15-year extension. But now they are allowed, so now people are consolidating. And the most recent thing in, January of this year, January 13th issue of The Economist, a good article about how the government is helping farmers further consolidate their plots and convert their production from simply growing grain, which is a commodity and not very well priced, to become specialist producers of vegetables. And the government is further helping them and do this by using GPS to get more detailed plot boundaries and pilot programs to use those land rights as collateral for borrowing. So you can see step by step. This is another thing I would emphasize again quickly. The Chinese reformed to much more market-oriented methods, and using personal incentives was gradual. Whereas Russia, when they overthrew the Soviet Union, they tried to go from complete communism to complete capitalism almost overnight under Boris Yeltsin. And frankly, it was a tremendous failure. They still have not successfully privatized their agriculture industry, and it's extremely weak. They're importing the vast majority of their food, Russia, when what was once agricultural breadbasket of Eastern and Central Europe. But in China, yes, they're importing food, but they're more than feeding themselves. And again, their agricultural productivity is going up, and they know how to keep improving on it. They still have to, because there's still about 30% of the population working in agriculture and only producing about 8% of GDP. So they still, frankly, overall, and this is another kind of scary thing. As much progress as they've made, and we'll still see a little bit more, labor productivity in China on the whole is still only 1/4 that of what it is in the United States. In other words, on average, it takes 3 times as much labor to get a given unit of output as we require. Yet they've still been able to do what they've been able to accomplish. But what that means is there's still greater potential for future growth. And that can be awesome or that can be scary. So now if we look at GDP, total value of all goods and services, not per person, this is the grand total. According to most sources, if you look at it in terms of purchasing power parity, which takes into account the difference in cost of living in the two countries, they've already passed us. We're not number one anymore. In terms of purchasing power parity, which is what most people think is the valid measure, they have a bigger economy than we do. Now, they also have, 4 times as many people. So their average standard of living is still only 1/4 of ours. But you build your military based on your total size of your economy, not necessarily your per capita. So this means if they have a bigger economy than us, they conceivably someday could match our military or even surpass it. And that's what has some people concerned. Yes, China's growth rate has slowed a little bit, but they're still growing more than twice as fast as we are, or the European or Japan economies. Since the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, 40% of all the world's growth has occurred in China. According to Graham Allison, another book I'm going to cite today, China is creating a new India every 6 months. That's truly mind-boggling. In other words, their economy is growing by the size of India's economy every 6 months. We try to do something here, like fix our roads in the state of Wisconsin. We're told, hey, Rome was not built in a day. In fact, by 2005, China was building the square foot equivalent of today's Rome, every 2 weeks. Between 2011 and 2013, China both produced and used more cement than the United States did in the entire 20th century. I told you there were some scary things here. They figured out a way to build skyscrapers, prefabricate huge skyscrapers. In 2011, one company built a 30-story skyscraper in 15 days. 3 years later, another one built a 57-story building in 19 days. There's this new convention and exhibition center in Tianjin, China. It was completed in 8 months. Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, said 8 months. Back here in Washington, D.C., it took them that long to fix 2 escalators of 21 steps each at the metro station. High-speed rail, we just don't have time to go on everything. They built 16,000 miles of high-speed rail in the last 10 years, more than any other country by far. We've tried to build a 570-mile high-speed rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and that started in 2008. Also, they've just postponed the finish of that to the year 2029. By that time, China will have built another 16,000 miles. Okay, this could go on and on, but we have a few other points to look at.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Now, Soviet infrastructure building has been badly discredited in many ways, and I wondered if China's buildings are holding up. That was a standard question.
That's fine. They had a couple accidents on the high-speed rail, but only a couple, and they're mainly up and functioning. And they've had a couple examples of shoddy materials, and that's part of this corruption issue. But no, for the most part, it's been fine. It has not been bad at all, overall. And when you consider, you know, they're new to all this, it's truly amazing. But it's a good question because that's something to keep your eye on. Now, a couple quotes. This kind of brings us up to the last points. Let China sleep, when she wakes, she will shake the world. That was Napoleon in 1817. And you know, when Mao took over for the communists and pronounced the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949, at the Tiananmen Square, overlooking it from the balcony there in the Forbidden City, outside the Forbidden City, he said, China has stood up. Well, China may have thrown off what he considered the imperialist yoke, but it hadn't stood up. Now China has stood up because their economy is working, which it didn't under Mao. This was a sign that Graham Allison says he saw in the Pentagon back during the Cold War era. If we ever faced a real enemy, we'd be in deep trouble. What did that mean? Soviet Union was pretty scary, wasn't it? With all those nuclear warheads and all those tanks and artillery guns. What was the weakness there? Why weren't they a real enemy? Their economy was crap. I can say that in the library, can't I? Or I have to whisper it. Their economy was crap. No, they never figured out how to use market mechanisms and personal incentives the way the Chinese have. Their economy was moribund. They weren't going anywhere. They had a first world army and a third world society. People had to wait in line for hours to get a loaf of bread. The economy was a basket case. Think how menacing the Soviet Union would have been if they actually had a dynamic economy. They didn't. Now, we have a communist country that does have a dynamic economy. I gave you the Kissinger quote earlier. Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, China's economic explosion is like the English Industrial Revolution and the Global Information Revolution, combusting simultaneously and compressed not into 300 years, but 30. And Lee Kuan Yew, who was the leader and the real driving force behind making Singapore the tremendous economic success that it has become, said it is not possible to pretend that this is just another big player. This is the biggest player in the history of the world, or soon will be. So now we come to the new Silk Road. Again, kind of went over that, but this is how they're using their new economic power to reach out, build networks, build alliances, build common interests. And this doesn't even show there are some in Latin America as well, some initiatives in Latin America. Now we'll turn to the military briefly. Yes, the U.S. still has a big edge. Whoops. We still have a big edge. But again, if our military spending and our economy are growing 2 or 3% a year, and the Chinese economy and military spending are growing 6 or 7% a year, which is the current rate, how long before they could catch up? Not that long. So this is concerning. Okay, we just really don't have time. I have all the different breakdowns of different people. Chinese are actually cutting the number of soldiers a lot, but they're giving them better training and better equipment. We have a lot more planes, but they're developing advanced stealth fighters also. That could be a factor if, we're engaged in the South China Sea. Tanks, I don't know if we're going to be fighting with tanks. 19 aircraft carriers, that sounds a little high. But they have one aircraft carrier that they bought from Russia and they're refurbished. Now they're building one of their own. There's no doubt we have a superiority in every significant category. But the other issue, though, is, you know, are we able to project our power? And up till now we have been. But this is where the next tests could come, because China is making kind of outlandish claims here. They're claiming everything inside the red line, whereas the international law of the sea limits claims to 200 miles out from your own borders. So like Brunei here, that's 200 miles out from their border. That's according to law. So, and the same for Malaysia, Philippines, you see is out here about 200 miles. Vietnam. Why is China making outlandish claims like this? They're making it based on history. They're saying, well, historically in the Qing dynasty we controlled this, so we should still be able to. Certainly I don't buy that, but it was kind of what Teddy Roosevelt said about the Panama Canal, you know, back a little bit over 100 years ago. But this is an area where we could have problems for sure over these, because China is dumping sand and trying to turn some of these uninhabited islands into things they could actually use for oil exploration or other things. Here's kind of wargaming by the Rand Corporation. So again, basically, especially with Spratly Islands, it's mainly green. That means we have major advantage. There's a few light green and yellow ones, but no red ones. Taiwan conflict is a little more even, and they're getting more even over time. These are things we'd have to have a whole separate session on, but I think the main thing is, you know, is China a threat? Or is it possible they will have a peaceful rise? And John Mearsheimer is one who believes already back in 2001 that he did see China's growth was making it more powerful than even the former Soviet Union that we had a confrontation with during the Cold War. On the other hand, Graham Allison in his book, Destined for War, which I highly recommend also. I don't think the library has this one in the catalog yet. I looked it up. Might want to put it on the list. I think it'd get a good readership. Graham Allison has been around for a long time. It seems like I even read a book of his in college, although maybe it was grad school. Essence of Decision. About the Cuban Missile Crisis. But at this point, he and a team took a look at other cases in the last 500 years in which a dominant power, like the United States is today, or like the United Kingdom was around 1900, has been challenged by a newly emerging and growing stronger party, like Germany was challenging the United Kingdom in around 1900. And of course that one did result in two wars, two horrendous wars, World War I and World War II. On the other hand, in other cases, war has been avoided. So I think this is the main challenge that Graham Allison poses to us. We have an existing established power, the United States. We have an emerging power, China, that I think he and I are trying to show you today just how strong they really are becoming so rapidly. Will this be like the majority of those cases? Out of the 16 that they studied, 12 did end in war. Or will it become like one of the other 4 cases in which the differences were resolved and the parties were able to coexist. That is our challenge. There's no obvious solution. We have to work at this. We have to defend our interests, but make sure we're doing it in an intelligent way and a strategic way, and a way that is hopefully far-sighted and not just reacting to momentary issues, but trying to be strategic and understand our true interests. I don't have any better answer than that. I've given you the challenge, but we as citizens now we have to think this through, discuss it with our leaders, and try to come up with a good answer. Thank you very much.
All right. Did you need some more water?
Yes, please.
Okay, let me pass the microphone off and I'll get you some water. We have our first question right here.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering what the one-child policy, what the impact that would have on this phenomenal growth. I seem to recall reading some time ago that that would limit the length of, or period of time that China would be preeminent.
Very good point. And I try to point out a couple of their vulnerabilities, and there are more, but that's a good one. Because, you know, for 30 plus years ago, they more or less established a policy that you as a couple can only have one child. And it wasn't totally rigidly enforced at all times, but most of the time it was. Well, they thought they had to do that at the time, or otherwise they would have overpopulation that they definitely wouldn't be able to feed. Because Mao, after the die-off of the Great Leap Forward of 30 million people, he's out there encouraging them to have as many kids as possible. Because we just lost 30 million people. So they're having a lot of kids. And then the more far-sighted rulers, you know, came along and said, wait a second, if this keeps up, you know, we'll be overwhelmed. So the one-child policy, I'm not talking about the morality of it. I don't think it's moral. I think it's immoral. But they did it. And it did staunch the population growth. They're going to peak at probably 1.5, 1.6 billion in the next 15 years or so. But what it also has done has given them a prematurely aging population. Because now their parents are aging and there's only one child either to support them with money, which was the traditional way in China. You supported, the children supported the parents in their old age and infirmity. Now there's only one child to do that. Or secondly, there's only one person working to support 2 retired people. Or 4 if you count grandparents, right. So a lot of countries have this problem. Japan has it big time right now. South Korea has a big time. They stopped having kids about 15 or so years ago. So they're not the only ones with this problem, but it is a problem. So they fended off the overpopulation situation, but in doing so they created in the next generation an aging, and you're also correct that unless you have breakthroughs like that spinning jenny I was talking about earlier, 66-to-1 advantages. And without breakthroughs like that, you can only grow if you have a growing population. Again, we don't want runaway growth, but moderate growth of population. That's how you can grow your economy. So you're right, it's a problem.
There's also probably a big gender disparity among the young people there.
Yes. For cultural reasons, the question was, there's also a gender disparity. And that's true because abortion was legal and it was not legal to do a sex-selective abortion, but they were doing it anyway sometimes because sons were still preferred. And so you have, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but several million more males than females of that particular cohort born during that period. Again, same in India, same in some other countries, but that's also a problem. A lot of unhappy Chinese bachelors out there. I'm serious. And you see their movies or read the novels or other things. That's one reason they have to work so damned hard to get rich. It's the only way they'll get a woman. Sorry if I'm crass about it, but that's not me thinking, that's them thinking. Yes, over here.
You mentioned the billionaire trucking executives. There are also billionaire entertainment executives, and one of them actually affects Manitowoc. If you've been past what was Carmike Theater, you'll notice the name is now changed to AMC. That is owned by a company called Dali and Wong, which is a majority Chinese company, and they own more than half of AMC theaters. And they're into things like Miss America and all those kind of contests. So
Yes.
they're putting their money everywhere.
Thank you very much. That's true. I'm sure that's true, and I read that myself, and I didn't remember it. But the figure I ran across today was just last year, they invested $54 billion in U.S. businesses, direct investment, not just buying our bonds. That was another huge amount. This is how they're using their trade surplus. They're not sitting on it. They're investing it back here. And again, of course, why do they do that? Because they're nice? Because they want to be our friend? They do it because they can make money from it. But we can make money from them. This is the biggest fallacy that I hear out in the public realm today. That if one party is gaining, they must be stealing it from the other one. No, we can both gain. If we both are doing something that we're good at and I do what I'm best at, then we maximize our productivity, and we're creating wealth, both of us. And we both get a share depending on what we're willing to pay for the share that we want. I saw nobody ever ushered into Walmart with a gun pointed at their head and forced to buy. I have yet to see that.
All right, there's a question.
I knew
Oops,
someone
sorry.
once who was
Back here.
shopping in Walmart when it wasn't open. That wasn't good. Okay. But just quickly, 54 billion. Jack Ma, multi-billionaire, founder of Alibaba. This is the biggest e-commerce firm in the world. He wants to get Alibaba in the United States. But mainly what that means is our merchants, Amazon, you name it, whoever, will now be selling to the Chinese market with the Chinese people pushing a button and buying our stuff. That is a win-win situation. Sir.
Yeah. A while back you had a slide up there kind of posing a question, will China's rise be a peaceful one, or are they going to be a threat? Well, I noticed you didn't talk a whole lot about North Korea tonight. How do you see that? I mean, for years we swore up and down that we would never tolerate North Korea as a nuclear power. Well, here they are. And the fat little guy that Trump likes to call Rocket Man, would he be anything if he wasn't completely backed up by China? And would it be correct to look at North Korea, the whole situation, as sort of like the tip of China's spear? And that's another threat. Not just the South China Sea, although that's another sphere. But I mean, how do you see that whole North Korean situation? Is that the tip of China's spear too?
No, I don't see North Korea as China's spear. I think more of a shield, quite honestly. I think China might be uncomfortable with a united Korean peninsula that's hostile to them. So it's I think they see it as a buffer. But I think they do not want it to blow up. But it's the main reason we don't go to war with North Korea right now, in my opinion, and this, I think you can find a lot of support for this, is not because China would come to their defense. I don't think they would, and I don't think that's the major reason. The major reason is they have got so many artillery pieces, conventional weapons, trained on Seoul, Korea, which is a metro area of about 30 million people, and it's only less than 40 miles, well within artillery range. They also have tunnels through which they can usher 100,000 troops an hour into South Korea. Now, could we carry out a preemptive strike to wipe all of that out so that they couldn't do that? We don't think we could. If we thought we could, we might do it. And frankly, I don't want to see this menace. And if I thought we could carry out a successful preemptive strike without losing hundreds of thousands of innocent South Korean lives, I would support it. But it's not just me. Steve Bannon said what I have just told you in an interview shortly after he left the White House. You know, he put it in slightly different terms, but basically this is what he is saying. That they have us in a very difficult spot because we know they're evil enough to do it. And if it looks like they're going to go out, they'll probably choose to go out with a bang and kill as many people as possible. And that is very hard to deal with. So that's another one.
So the bottom line, almost for the time being, seems to be we're going to have to accept them as a fully fledged nuclear power.
Honestly, I think, you know, there's ways of trying to lessen that, maybe through cyber warfare means, like we did with Iran. We did slow down their nuclear program with a Stuxnet virus. Negotiations, I know that so far that's just given them more time to develop more weapons. Ultimately, you do rely on deterrence. You say, if you ever even seriously contemplated using a nuclear weapon on us, we would annihilate you. That's how we kept the Soviet Union from using theirs for, you know, from what? Roughly the 1950s, for, you know, 40 years. So I toss and turn over that one myself. I don't like it. I'm very uncomfortable with it. But the trouble is they've had those emplacements and those tunnels there for decades. Okay, I know I know we have other questions. Can I just say one other thing about this? Again, I think history matters. Korean War. Douglas MacArthur is our commander-in-chief, UN forces. We crossed the 38th parallel, which China said, we don't want you to do that. We went up near the Yalu River. China sent in the volunteers. We're fighting the Chinese. At that time, Douglas MacArthur tried to convince President Truman, we need an all-out mobilization, take the war into China, into mainland China, and get rid of the communist government of China right now for once and for all. This was 1951. Okay, Truman said no. Okay, why? Because he was chicken? Where would we have gotten the troops from in 1951 to send 500,000 or 1 million troops into Asia to fight China on Chinese soil? If that was even a good idea to begin with. But just say we're thinking about it. Where would we get the troops for that? They'd have to come from Europe. And what are they doing in Europe in 1951? They're holding the Soviet Union away from Western Europe. Are we going to abandon Berlin? Are we going to abandon West Germany? See, MacArthur thought we should. Because MacArthur was an Asian file, if that's a word. He specifically stated the history of humankind for the next 10,000 years is going to be decided on the continent of Asia. Well, maybe some of what we've said tonight might show he wasn't completely wrong about that, but what he wanted to do about it just ran unacceptable risks and costs at that time. And so that's why we've had to live with a North Korean regime and a Chinese communist regime that whole time, because the risks and the price of trying to get rid of them was just too great. But now we are stuck with a problem, and believe me, I toss and turn over it too.
Right up here.
I have a couple of questions. First, what is Thucydides' trap, if I'm saying that correctly?
Oh, yes, thank you. So, that's in this book, soon to be available at your friendly local library. I get no commission on this, by the way. Thucydides' trap, sorry, I sloughed over that. That refers to the Peloponnesian War in Greece in the 4th century BC between Athens and Sparta. So at the time, Sparta was the dominant power, but Athens was rising. You know, this is a time of Alexander the Great and so forth, or I guess he came a little bit later, but Athens was really flowering and growing economically, and a military too, and a navy especially. And Sparta felt threatened by this. And so if you read Thucydides wrote the book and basically said the Peloponnesian Wars happened because Sparta was the dominant power and Athens was the newly emerging power, and it frightened Sparta and it backed them into a corner and felt they had no choice but to go to war. Now it was a disastrous war, it lasted about 30 years and a tremendous amount of destruction. But what Graham Allison is saying, and he had a whole team to work on this of researchers. Let's look at these other cases. And we'll only go back 500 years so that it's more modern times. And in the modern times, they found 12 other cases. As I said, for instance, Germany against UK. But on the other hand, the US also challenged the UK with no war. But we had a similar heritage. And we had our differences. Not after 1900, but anyway, 12 of the 14 did end in war. So what he's doing in the book then is just trying to say, okay, what are the lessons that are learned? And paranoia, of course, is one problem. That if you really fear somebody, you're going to attribute the worst motives to them. And if you really think they're going to do the worst thing to you, well, then you better do it to them first. And then they're thinking the same way. But it can be avoided. So in the 4 cases, it was avoided. So thank you. That's the whole premise of the book. But a lot of it is about China. So it's well worth a good read, but also a good brush up on history.
Thank you. And then my second question, could you talk some about the medical system, and has that kept up with the growth in China, or what is the medical system like?
Okay, I know quite a bit, a little bit about that. You have to realize, again, even with their tremendous growth, their per capita income is still only about 1/4 of ours. So if we're at 50-some thousand per person, which I believe we are, they're at maybe 14 or 15. So that's a heck of a lot better than $150 a year, which it was when I first went there. It's astronomical. That's why they tolerate the oppression of the regime. They've seen their lives improve so much. But as far as medicine goes, they don't have a good insurance program. And they don't have a good safety net. So if you have to go to the hospital, they make you pay up front. This is one reason why the Chinese save over 50% of their income. Now, don't get me wrong, they're still consuming out there because they have so much more income than they had before. They're the number one market for motor vehicles now, 2 million a year in China alone. Biggest market in the world for cell phones, for sure. They buy a lot of luxury goods, but they also save about half their income. If we saved even a fraction of that, we'd have no trade deficit with China, folks. We have very low savings, and in some of the mid-George W. Bush years, it wasn't his fault, I'm just saying that because of the timing of it. 2005, 2006, in that era, we had negative saving in this country. We were spending more than we were making. Why? Because we thought our houses were going up in value. We were borrowing against that, and we were buying everything in sight. I used to get actual checks in the mail in around 2005, 2006. These were real checks. All I had to do was endorse it for $85,000, $90,000, $90,000. I'm not kidding you. Maybe some of you got these. Why would they send me a check? Now, it wasn't a gift. It wasn't Publishers Clearinghouse. It was a loan. But there was no collateral. There was no credit check. Just endorse it. And how did they arrive at the figure? They knew how much equity I had in my home, and then they tacked on an extra 25%. An extra 25%. And a lot of us were taking them up on this. And we're spending more than we were actually making. And that contributed to this bubble and the collapse. The other reason, their Social Security is next to nothing. They just haven't been able to afford it yet. So that means I need to save for my old age. I got to actually have cash. And especially if I only have one kid to support 4 grandparents. So they're saving to pay the hospital before they get the x-ray or the appendectomy. Because otherwise they won't get it. So their health care is way better. If I looked at, just quickly, we can allow another 10 minutes. Can we till 10:10? Can you kick everybody out of the library in 10 minutes?
We can.
Okay, thank you. In 1949, the average life expectancy was 36. 80% were illiterate. By 2014, life expectancy is 76, and 95% are literate. Millions of individuals will experience a 100-fold increase in their living standard over their lifetime. That means moving from an absolute shack into a pretty decent apartment or home. It means having a toilet. And Kohler Company is selling them those toilets. I've seen them. I've seen them take the toilets home on the bicycle. So, you see, this is what we have to understand. They started way down here. They've made a lot of progress. They still have a long way to go. And it's a struggle. They're not trying to steal anything from us except some of our intellectual property. Okay, I'll grant you that. But you know how some of the advanced spinning and weaving machinery from England found its way to New England? A man named Lowell, that they named Lowell, Massachusetts after, he went over there on an inspection tour around 1800 again. And it turns out, oh, that's a very interesting looking setup there. Went home to his inn and had his ale and made sketches well into the night. Not excusing it. I've seen the knockoff goods. I've had students on my tour buy the $5 Rolex Some of them got proud of their bargaining. I got 2 for $5. And they wore them both at the same time. That's called being extravagant. And the funny thing was, the next day, one was 2 hours fast, the other was 2 hours slow. So actually, I guess if you averaged it, it was okay. But anyway, no, I'm not trying to excuse theft of intellectual property at all. That's what we can enforce. We have mechanisms. We have ways of enforcing that, and we need to enforce that. We need to show them that it's not in their interest to be doing it either.
So do we have a foreign policy now?
You mean right now, today?
Right now, yeah. Other than rhetoric, I mean.
What? I try to stay out of partisan issues. And so what I say is not partisan. But I don't think there's a clear set of objectives and a clear statement of the means to accomplish the objectives. And frankly, what I see way too much of is portraying ourselves as the poor victims that have been so taken advantage of. And that's so appealing, because who doesn't like to say, oh gosh, I haven't gotten my fair share. But the NATO, our NATO alliance, has kept us very big, important factor in keeping us out of World War III. That was an alliance and a network that the Soviets knew they would confront, not just us. And that was extremely important. And if we paid 1% or 2% more because we had it, I don't think that makes us horribly victimized. We were doing what we thought was best to protect ourselves. You know, I think of great foreign policy triumphs in this country, and I think of something like the Marshall Plan. So after World War II, you know, Europe is in ruins. The people have no jobs because the factories are destroyed. They can't grow crops because the fields are destroyed. There's movies that show this, like Vittorio De Sica's The Bicycle Thief. The people are trading in their bed linens just to get money. They're pawning their bed linens to get money to eat. And of course, who's benefiting from this? The Communist Party. Because they're promising them, oh, become a communist, vote us into office, we'll take care of you. But our people, including Secretary Marshall, General Marshall, then he became Secretary of Defense, said, no, we have to dig down deep for, at the time, billions and billions of dollars. And we will lend it to them. It's not a gift. But this will help them rebuild the factories, reestablish the fields. And then as they get better and are more productive, they'll pay us back, which they did. But what if I'd said, nope, it's America first and you're on your own? What if we'd done that? It wouldn't have been good. It could have been a disaster. So you see, sometimes, you know what I really think is the real problem? Is zero-sum thinking. That if you gain, you must have stolen it from me somehow. Or if I gain, no, we work together. And, you know, I do what some people thought I was halfway good at, teaching. And they paid me for that. And then I went to the plumber. I said, fix my pipes in my toilet, please, because I don't know how. And I gave him money. And then he gave his workers money. And then he perhaps sent his daughter or son to Ripon College, and they paid me money. We all benefited. What we have to do is, very few things in this world are really zero-sum. A poker game, yeah, if you have X number of people playing poker, they only bring in so much money, yeah, there's no new money created. What's that?
That's called luck.
Yeah, it's redistributed, but it's not created. Just bear with me 1 minute. I mean, I know this is elementary. I know you all probably understand this. But, you know, if there's a stone lying out in the field somewhere, a big rock, probably has virtually no value. I mean, I'm all for the environment, but there's a lot of rocks. But if I take that rock and I make bricks out of it or stone blocks out of it. That takes effort and ingenuity. Now I can build a house. And now I've taken that thing, by applying my ingenuity and my labor, I've created something of value. This is what the Chinese have been doing. They weren't creating any value because they weren't working hard, they weren't working efficiently, they weren't working productively, they had no incentive to use their ingenuity. What they're doing now is they're creating tremendous amounts of wealth. And they're making things. Some of the wealth comes from us because we like it for the price that it's being offered at. If we don't buy it. And similarly, they buy plenty of stuff from us, and it's going to be more and more every year. Don't let those trade balances fool you. First of all, they're not value added. So that iPhone that comes from China, 90% of the value added was added in the United States. But the total value, it's Apple that made the money from that, and the higher ups at Apple. And the Chinese people that put it together get very little of that. But it's all counted as an import. That's wrong. You should only look at value-added values. Secondly, it doesn't take into account services. We have a surplus in trade with China on services. And there's even more reasons. Just because somebody has a trade balance that's positive with us does not mean they're stealing from us. It maybe means we're not saving enough. It maybe means they're better at making certain kinds of things right now than we are. And then we should concentrate on what we're good at. Do you know how much corn and soybeans we sell to China every year? Untold billions of dollars. Huge. So just the biggest problem, I think, is the self-victimization and the zero-sum thinking. Yeah, if I come up to you with a gun and say, give me your money, yeah, that's zero-sum. Short of that, most things aren't. So please look and see how these mutually beneficial relationships actually work. And don't let people fool you into thinking you're being robbed when actually all that's happening is people are trying to lift themselves up off the floor of a horrible existence and have some kind of a halfway decent life. Okay, thank you.
That's a great place to end. Thank you very much for coming. Hopefully you can join us next week. Next week's topic revolves around the media, so it's definitely sure to be another great evening of great decisions at the library. And another hand for Professor Farrell. That was a fantastic night.
I will also make sure the book he's mentioned is purchased tomorrow, so if you start looking at the catalog on Thursday, you can put a hold on it.
He is great.
Beth Doherty.